They say a photograph can freeze a moment, but this one is more than just frozen in time. It's a puzzle. You see, when most people hear the name Mahatma Gandhi, they picture a frail old man wrapped in simple white cloth, walking barefoot, leaning on a wooden staff, his eyes radiating quiet defiance. But in this image, he's none of those things. It's 1906. He's 37 years old, dressed in a dark, perfectly tailored suit, hair neatly parted, mustache groomed. A crisp white collar frames his neck. His gaze? Steady, sharp, almost piercing. The man in this portrait looks like a young lawyer ready to conquer the world, not the saintly figure who would one day challenge an empire without lifting a weapon. And that's the hook. Who is this man? Because here's the truth. In 1906, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was not yet the Mahatma, the great soul. He was a man standing at a crossroads, torn between two worlds, the orderly, ambitious life of a successful lawyer, and the calling of something far more dangerous, far more consuming, and far more uncertain. But to understand the fire behind those eyes, we need to strip away the layers of legend and step into the mind of Gandhi before the world knew his name. Imagine this. The photo is taken in Johannesburg, South Africa. Outside, the sun burns across the streets. Inside, the air smells faintly of ink, paper, and the polished wood of the photographer's studio. Gandhi sits stiffly in front of the camera, his hands perhaps resting on his lap, his back straight. He doesn't smile, not because he's unhappy, but because in those days, photographs were serious affairs. But there's something else, something in his eyes that speaks of a storm forming beneath the surface. You wouldn't know it from the clean lines of his suit, but just years earlier, Gandhi had been thrown off a train in Pietermaritzburg, South Africa, for refusing to move from a whites-only compartment, despite holding a first-class ticket. That night, shivering in the cold at the station, he began to question not just his own dignity, but the system that allowed such humiliation to exist. That night lit a spark. By 1906, that spark was aflame. But here's the twist. He wasn't yet the man who would lead salt marches or inspire global movements. He was still becoming. And becoming is never clean. It's messy. It's filled with contradictions. At this point in his life, Gandhi still wrestled with ambition. He had built a successful law practice, wore fine clothes, and moved among the well-educated elite. But every case he took, every law he argued, every injustice he witnessed, especially against his fellow Indians living under South Africa's racial laws, chipped away at his old self. In 1906, that was the year it all shifted. In September of that year, the Transvaal government introduced a new law, the Asiatic Registration Act, which forced all Indian residents to register with the authorities, carry identification at all times, and submit to humiliating procedures. To Gandhi, this was more than an inconvenience. It was a direct attack on dignity, an official stamp declaring that one group of people was worth less than another. In a packed meeting at the Empire Theatre in Johannesburg, Gandhi stood before a crowd of his fellow Indians, merchants, laborers, professionals, and asked them to take a vow, not just to protest, not just to petition, but to resist, no matter the cost. Even if that cost was prison, even if it was violence, even if it was death. He called it satyagraha, the force of truth. That night, under the dim glow of gas lamps, the room filled with murmurs of both fear and resolve. Some looked to the floor, imagining the consequences. Others clenched their fists. Gandhi's voice cut through. We shall not submit to this law, no matter what they do to us. And this is where the man in the photograph becomes more than just a young lawyer. Because while the camera that captured his image preserved a calm, composed figure, reality was different. Inside, Gandhi was stepping off the ledge of comfort into the abyss of resistance. He knew the risks. He knew he could lose his practice, his freedom, even his life. But in his mind, there was no turning back. Still, there's something we need to talk about here, something history books often soften. Gandhi in 1906 was still finding his moral compass. His views on race were not yet the enlightened ones he would later hold. He still saw the world, at times, through the lens of the colonial education he had absorbed. He believed in fighting for the rights of Indians, but his empathy for Black Africans was still growing, still incomplete. This is important because it reminds us that great leaders aren't born perfect. They evolve, and the man in this photograph was in the middle of that evolution. So, why does this matter to us now, over a century later? Because we are looking at a rare version of Gandhi, a Gandhi in transition. A Gandhi whose polished suit hides the battle scars of humiliation and the restless drive to change the rules of the game. If you were to walk into his law office that year, you'd find neatly stacked case files, the faint scratch of a pen across parchment, and perhaps a young Gandhi leaning over a desk, brow furrowed, crafting letters to government officials, clients, and community leaders. You'd see the professional, the strategist, the man who understood that the fight for justice wasn't just in the streets. It was also in the words carefully placed on paper, in the laws turned against those who wrote them. And yet, if you caught him late at night, in those quiet hours when the city slept, you might find him staring out a window, lost in thought, wondering where this path would lead, and whether he truly had the courage to walk it to the end. The photograph, then, is both a mask and a mirror. A mask, because it shows the outer layer of a man still presenting himself in the acceptable image of respectability. A mirror, because if you look closely enough, you can see the faint reflection of the revolution already taking root in his soul. And here's where I'll leave you with the first of many questions we'll answer in this journey. What happens when a man who has learned to play by the rules decides the rules themselves are the enemy? Because 1906 wasn't just another year in Gandhi's life. It was the year he stepped out of the safety of the courtroom and into the unpredictable, dangerous arena of civil resistance. A decision that would set him on a path to confront the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. But before we can walk with him into those confrontations, we need to know where he came from, what shaped him, what tested him, and why this man, above all others, would come to believe that truth and nonviolence could defeat armies. The answers lie not in the legend, but in the young man who sat before a camera in Johannesburg, 1906, and looked into the lens as if he could already see the battles ahead. And in the next chapter, we'll go there, to the dusty streets of his childhood, the halls of his education, the mistakes and awakenings that would transform a shy, uncertain boy into the man who would change the world. Before the man in the photograph stood in Johannesburg, before the polished suit and the vow of resistance, there was a boy. A small, shy boy born on October 2nd, 1869, in the coastal town of Porbandar in present-day Gujarat, India. His name, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Porbandar was a place of salt air and trade winds, of narrow streets winding between whitewashed buildings and markets thick with the sense of spice and incense. The boy's father, Karamchand Gandhi, was the Diwan, the chief minister of the small princely state. His mother, Putlabai, was deeply religious, her life a rhythm of prayer, fasting, and service to others. From the very beginning, young Mohandas was quiet, painfully quiet. He avoided confrontation, hated speaking in front of others, and often melted into the background when adults were talking. His voice, when it came, was soft, almost hesitant, as if words were heavy things that had to be carried carefully. But behind that silence was observation. Gandhi watched everything. The way merchants argued over prices, the way his mother's eyes softened when she gave food to the poor, the way power worked, subtle, invisible, in his father's political dealings. Yet childhood wasn't just gentle lessons. Gandhi also saw hypocrisy. He saw how rules bent for some and crushed others. He saw cruelty passed off as tradition. And sometimes he felt a storm inside himself, a mix of curiosity fear, and an instinct that something about the world wasn't quite right. As a boy, Gandhi wasn't the natural leader type. In fact, he was scared of the dark, frightened of snakes, and terrified of making mistakes. Once, after reading a popular tale of a great warrior, he tried to test his courage by holding a sword, but even the weight of the blade made him uneasy. He preferred books to weapons, quiet corners to crowded rooms. Yet, there was one lesson that took root early from his mother. She told him, "Truth is the highest duty." It sounded simple enough to a child, but it would become the anchor of his life. Still, Gandhi was not a saintly child. He lied once, over a piece of gold. His guilt burned so strongly that he wrote a confession to his father, too ashamed to say it aloud. His father's reaction, silent tears instead of anger, carved itself into Gandhi's heart. That moment taught him something no punishment could. Truth could hurt, but it could also heal. School for young Mohandas was unremarkable. He was an average student, often nervous, always careful. He didn't dominate the classroom. He simply passed through it. Teachers saw him as obedient, if somewhat forgettable. He wasn't the boy anyone would have bet on to stand against empires. And yet, little cracks began to form in his shell. When he was a teenager, a friend introduced him to meat, a forbidden food in his strict vegetarian household. Gandhi tried it, not out of rebellion, but because he'd heard meat made people strong, and he wanted to be strong enough to stand tall among the British. He ate in secret, each bite tasting of both power and shame. Eventually, his guilt over deceiving his parents became too heavy, and he stopped. There was another, darker temptation. His friend also persuaded him to smoke. Another secret violation of his upbringing. It wasn't the nicotine that hooked him, but the thrill of breaking rules. Still, even in rebellion, Gandhi found himself haunted by the need for truth. Each lie eroded something inside him, and he began to understand that strength wasn't about meat or cigarettes. It was about self-control. At 13, Gandhi's life changed dramatically. His family arranged his marriage, as was the custom, to a girl his own age, Kasturba. They were both children, unsure of what marriage even meant. For Gandhi, it was confusing, exciting, and suffocating all at once. He was deeply possessive of Kasturba at first, jealous when she spoke to other boys, stubborn when she resisted his instructions. In his later writings, he would admit shame over how he treated her in those early years. Another reminder that he was not born the wise, humble figure the world remembers. The young couple's lives were soon touched by loss. Gandhi's father grew gravely ill, and Mohandas spent nights massaging his father's legs, trying to ease the pain. One night, torn between duty and desire, he left his father's side to be with Kasturba. When he returned, his father was gone. The guilt of that moment, the feeling that pleasure had stolen him from his duty, would haunt him for decades. After his father's death, Gandhi's path shifted again. His family, wanting him to follow a respected profession, encouraged him to study law. But there was a problem. To study in England, Gandhi would have to break with some of his community's traditions, including dietary rules. The elders warned him against it. His mother feared he would be corrupted by Western ways. Gandhi swore an oath to her. He would abstain from meat, alcohol, and women while abroad. And so, in 1888, at the age of 18, Mohandas left India for the first time. Picture it. A thin young man boarding a ship bound for England, the salt spray of the Arabian Sea on his face, his eyes wide with the enormity of what lay ahead. He wore a black suit and a turban, the attire of dignity for a young Indian gentleman. His fellow passengers, British, mostly, regarded him with polite curiosity, some with disdain. London was a shock. The city was a roaring engine of carriages, gaslights, fog, and the clatter of industry. Gandhi enrolled at the Inner Temple to study law, but he quickly realized that surviving in this new world would require more than books. He learned to tie his tie properly, to use a knife and fork in the Western style, to speak in a polished English accent. He read not only legal texts, but also the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, and the works of Western philosophers. It was in London that Gandhi deepened his commitment to vegetarianism. Not out of duty to his mother's oath, but from a growing belief in compassion for all living beings. He joined the London Vegetarian Society, attended meetings, and even spoke publicly, a terrifying prospect for the shy young man. But each speech, no matter how small, was a step away from the boy who spoke in whispers. By the time Gandhi returned to India in 1891, law degree in hand, he had transformed, outwardly at least. He dressed sharply, carried himself with confidence, and was ready to begin his career as a barrister. But his early attempts to practice law in India were frustrating. His shyness still crippled him in the courtroom. He could barely bring himself to cross-examine witnesses. Then came the letter. An Indian merchant in South Africa needed legal help in a complicated case. The offer promised a year's work in a land Gandhi knew almost nothing about. It was an escape from the stagnation at home. And perhaps, he thought, a way to prove himself. He took the job. That single decision would alter the course of his life and the history of the 20th century. Because South Africa was not just a new opportunity. It was a crucible. It was where Gandhi would be stripped of illusions, where humiliation would become his teacher, and where the first seeds of satyagraha would be sown. And as we circle back toward the photograph in Johannesburg, we begin to see the outlines of that transformation. The man in the suit is not just the product of success. He is the product of wounds. Wounds that were about to deepen. In the next part, we'll walk beside him onto South African soil and into the moment that cracked his world wide open. A train ride that ended with him standing alone on a frozen platform, holding a ticket that meant nothing in the face of prejudice. The year was 1893. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was 23 years old, his black suit freshly pressed, his legal papers neatly stacked in his leather satchel. The train from Durban to Pretoria was his gateway to a new chapter, a one-year contract to assist an Indian merchant in a complex legal dispute. He held a first-class ticket. The compartment was warm, with upholstered seats and the faint scent of tobacco smoke lingering in the air. Outside, South Africa rolled past in shades of gold and green. Gandhi took in the view, unaware that in a few hours, his life would pivot on an act of quiet defiance. The first sign of trouble came at the station stop in Pietermaritzburg. A white passenger boarded and, upon seeing Gandhi, frowned. Moments later, a conductor entered. His tone was polite, but cold. "You'll have to move to third class." Gandhi looked up, startled. "I'm sorry, but I have a first-class ticket," he replied, producing it from his pocket. The conductor's eyes narrowed. "We don't allow colored people in first class." Gandhi's pulse quickened. He explained again, calmly, that his ticket was valid. But the conductor's voice hardened. "If you don't move, I'll have you removed." And then came the moment of choice. Gandhi could have avoided confrontation. He could have quietly gathered his things and stepped into third class, swallowing the insult. That would have been the easier path, the path he'd taken many times before when faced with small humiliations. But something in him refused. He sat still. The conductor left and returned with a policeman. The uniformed man didn't argue. He simply grabbed Gandhi's arm, pulled him from the seat, and pushed him toward the door. Gandhi's satchel was tossed after him. The train's whistle screamed, and in an instant, the carriage was gone, leaving him alone on the dark, windswept platform. It was winter in Pietermaritzburg. The air bit through his suit. Gandhi sat on a bench, his ticket still in his pocket, his breath clouding in the cold. The humiliation was sharp, but underneath it was something new, something dangerous to the world that had just rejected him. He thought of his oath to his mother, his studies in London, the ideals he had absorbed from law and scripture. And he thought of the simple fact that, even when you follow the rules, The rules can be turned against you if the system is built to keep you down. That night, under flickering gas lamps, Gandhi wrestled with the questions pounding in his mind. Should he return to India? Should he fight? Could one man make any difference at all? By morning, he had his answer, though he couldn't yet see where it would lead. He would stay. He would fight, not with fists or weapons, but with the only tools he trusted, truth and moral courage. This was not yet satyagraha. That would come years later, but the seed was planted. The train incident was only the beginning. Over the coming months, Gandhi would face countless reminders that, in South Africa, Indians were outsiders, tolerated only so long as they knew their place. He was barred from certain hotels, insulted in courtrooms, and mocked in the streets. And yet, each insult seemed to strip away another layer of the compliant young lawyer he had been. He began meeting with the Indian community, merchants, laborers, clerks, listening to their stories, their anger, their fear. They spoke of unfair taxes, of past laws, of the constant shadow of police harassment. Gandhi didn't just hear them. He felt their words as if they were his own wounds. In 1894, when the government tried to pass a bill stripping Indians of voting rights in Natal, Gandhi organized his first major petition. He printed forms, gathered thousands of signatures, and sent them to both the colonial government and the British authorities in London. The bill passed anyway, but Gandhi had learned something vital. Collective action was possible. Still, he was not yet the man in the 1906 photograph. His approach was cautious, legalistic. He wore Western clothes, spoke in the polished tones of an English-trained barrister, and appealed to the empire's sense of justice, a sense that, more often than not, was nowhere to be found. Years passed. Gandhi's one-year contract stretched into 2, then 3. South Africa was becoming not just a place of work, but a place of transformation. He brought his wife, Kasturba, and their children to join him. He opened a law office in Johannesburg. He built connections with both Indian and sympathetic white allies. But the humiliations never stopped. Once, he was ordered to remove his turban in court. When he refused, the magistrate had him ejected. Another time, he was kicked by a driver for walking too close to a footpath reserved for whites. Each time, the sting was real, but so was the clarity it brought. By the early 1900s, Gandhi began experimenting with small acts of resistance. He encouraged Indians to challenge discriminatory laws in court, to organize in societies, to write to newspapers. He himself began to live more simply, shedding some of the trappings of wealth, though the transformation was gradual. Then came 1906, the Asiatic Registration Act, a law so invasive, so degrading, that it made the train incident feel like a mere warning. The government demanded that all Indians register, give fingerprints, carry identification, and accept searches at any time. Failure to comply meant imprisonment or expulsion. For Gandhi, this was the breaking point. This was no longer about individual humiliation. This was about the systematic humiliation of an entire community. He called a mass meeting at the Empire Theatre in Johannesburg. Nearly 3,000 people attended. The hall was crowded, the air thick with tension. Gandhi stood before them, not as a lawyer making polite appeals, but as a man ready to defy the law. He asked them to take an oath, to resist the law no matter the cost. And they did. That night, Satyagraha was born. Now, when you look at the photograph from 1906, you can see it. The suit is still there, the lawyer's composure still intact. But behind his eyes is the memory of a freezing night on a train platform in Pietermaritzburg, and the knowledge that he would never again simply step aside. The young man who had once spoken in whispers was now prepared to speak in a voice the empire could not ignore. And in the next part, we'll watch how that voice was tested in the fires of arrest, trial, and prison. Gandhi would discover that resistance was not just an idea, it was a life that demanded everything. The Empire Theatre vow had been taken. Hundreds of Indian residents of the Transvaal had sworn, before God and each other, to defy the Asiatic Registration Act. It was a moment of unity, but unity is easy in the warmth of a crowded hall. The real test comes when the chill of consequences sets in. For Gandhi, the test arrived quickly. The Transvaal authorities moved fast. Notices went out. All Indians must present themselves to be fingerprinted and registered. Failure to do so would lead to prosecution. For many, fear not at resolve. The penalty was no longer theoretical, it was personal. Gandhi, of course, did not register. He waited. He wanted to be arrested first, not because he craved martyrdom, but because leadership, he believed, had to bear the first blow. If he expected others to risk their freedom, he could not hide behind his title or his profession. The knock came on a January morning in 1908. Uniformed men entered his office, their boots loud on the wooden floor. The warrant was read aloud. Gandhi stood, buttoned his coat, and offered his wrists without protest. Outside, the sun was bright, the streets busy. People stopped and stared as the small, bespectacled man in a dark suit was led away between two policemen. Some looked confused. Others smiled faintly, as if they had just witnessed something both strange and significant. The jail was a far cry from the ordered world of Gandhi's law office. The air was thick with sweat and disinfectant. The cells were bare, cold, and loud with the clank of iron doors. Gandhi was placed in a small room with a cot, a thin blanket, and nothing else. The first night was the hardest. Sleep was impossible, not just because of the hardness of the cot or the noises of the prison, but because of the thoughts racing through his mind. What if the movement failed? What if the community abandoned him? What if this was the end before it had truly begun? But as the days passed, something unexpected happened. The fear ebbed. In its place came a strange calm. Prison stripped him of distractions. There were no meetings to attend, no letters to write, no suits to press. There was only time, and in that time, Gandhi found clarity. He read the Bhagavad Gita, its verses echoing in the small space, reminding him of duty without attachment to results. He thought about the vow they had taken and how easily words could crumble without action. And he realized that his arrest was not the failure of the movement, it was its birth. After a few weeks, Gandhi was brought to trial. The courtroom was packed. The prosecutor laid out the facts plainly. Gandhi had defied the law. Gandhi did not deny it. In fact, he insisted on admitting it. His statement to the judge was simple. I have broken the law, not out of disrespect for authority, but out of respect for justice. The judge sentenced him to 2 months in prison with hard labor. Hard labor meant breaking stones under the sun, carrying heavy loads, and following the shouted orders of warders who took pleasure in reminding prisoners of their place. Gandhi's hands blistered, his muscles ached. The rough prison clothes chafed his skin. Meals were coarse, served in tin bowls. But Gandhi bore it without complaint. Word of his imprisonment spread. In the Indian community, something began to shift. If the man they knew as a lawyer, educated in London, could endure prison, perhaps they could too. Each arrest became a rallying point. Instead of discouraging resistance, the government's crackdown seemed to fertilize it. When Gandhi was released, the crowd that greeted him outside the prison was larger than any he had spoken to before. They cheered. They garlanded him with flowers. They pressed his hands in thanks. Gandhi smiled, but his mind was already on the next step. Prison had not broken him. It had steeled him. And yet, he also understood something dangerous. This path was not only about enduring injustice, it was about inviting it. Each act of resistance would bring retaliation, and each retaliation would require even more courage from the community. If their courage failed, the movement would collapse. Gandhi began traveling between towns, speaking in crowded halls, in markets, even in open fields. His message was consistent: resist without violence. Submit to arrest without struggle. Accept the punishment without hatred. It sounded simple, almost naive. But Gandhi understood that this was not passivity. It was a calculated form of combat. It forced the oppressor to show their hand, to reveal the violence that underpinned their authority. And in doing so, it aimed to awaken the conscience of the world. The next arrests came quickly. Men, women, even teenagers began refusing to register. Whole families appeared in court, calmly accepting sentences. Jails filled. Newspapers began to take notice. The image of Indians in South Africa shifted from that of a silent, submissive minority to a determined, principled community willing to suffer for dignity. But the government was not moved by conscience. They doubled down. They increased sentences. They deported some resistors. They fined others heavily, hoping to break them financially. Gandhi himself would be arrested multiple times in the coming years. Each time, he emerged leaner, quieter, but somehow stronger. Prison became both his battlefield and his pulpit. And all the while, the man in the 1906 photograph, the man in the suit, with the steady gaze, was slowly shedding that outer shell. The suit would remain for now, but beneath it, something far more unshakable was forming. The identity of a man who no longer feared loss. Because once you've sat in a cell, stripped of everything but your thoughts, you begin to understand that freedom is not just the absence of chains. It is the refusal to submit in spirit. And in the next chapter, we'll see Gandhi face not just prison, but betrayal. Allies would falter, agreements would be broken, and he would learn that the road to justice is not a straight line. It is a path that twists through doubt, compromise, and the painful lessons of trust misplaced. By 1908, Satyagraha was no longer just a word whispered in crowded halls. It was a living, breathing movement. Hundreds of Indians in the Transvaal had refused to register under the Asiatic Act. Many had been fined. Many more had served prison sentences. Gandhi himself had been arrested, tried, and sentenced multiple times. The government had expected fear to do its work. It had not. Instead, each imprisonment seemed to strengthen the resolve of the community. The jails were full, and the law's enforcement was proving costly and chaotic. So, in early 1908, the colonial administration made a move that caught many off guard. They reached out to Gandhi. Through intermediaries, they proposed a compromise. If the Indian community would voluntarily register, without the degrading fingerprinting process, the Asiatic Act would be repealed. It was, on paper, a victory. The hated law would be gone. The principle of voluntary action would be upheld. And the government would save face. Gandhi, cautious but hopeful, agreed to meet with General Jan Smuts, the Minister of the Interior, a tall, imposing man whose cool gaze could chill a room. Smuts spoke with the precision of a lawyer and the confidence of a man used to command. The two men sat across from each other, separated by a polished wooden table and by visions of the future that could not have been more different. They negotiated for hours. Gandhi made it clear. The community would only comply if the promise was genuine. Smuts assured him it was. Finally, they shook hands. It was done. Gandhi left the meeting believing that, for the first time, peaceful resistance had not just defied the law, it had changed it. The victory was symbolic as much as practical. It proved that nonviolent pressure could force even the colonial government to the table. In the weeks that followed, Gandhi urged the community to register voluntarily. Some hesitated, suspicious of the government's intentions. Others, exhausted by months of struggle, welcomed the compromise. One by one, people came forward. Gandhi himself was among the first, setting the example. And then, the blow fell. The Asiatic Act was not repealed. Smuts had not delivered. The voluntary registrations were used by the government as proof that the Indian community had accepted the principle of the law. The fingerprinting process, though temporarily softened, was not abolished. The promise was a trap. The news spread like wildfire. In markets, in temples, In the dusty streets of Johannesburg and Pretoria, people spoke Gandhi's name with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Some accused him of being naive, of trusting a government that had never shown good faith. Others wondered if he had betrayed them. For Gandhi, the betrayal was personal. He had trusted Smuts, not because he saw him as a friend, but because he believed that even political adversaries could honor an agreement. That belief was shattered. The day the truth became clear, Gandhi sat in his modest home, the sound of voices from the street drifting through the window. Kasturba entered, her face lined with concern. "They're saying the movement is finished," she told him quietly. Gandhi closed his eyes. The weight of leadership pressed down like iron. If trust in him was gone, the movement would crumble. If the people believed nonviolence led only to humiliation, they would turn away from it forever. That night, Gandhi called an emergency meeting. The hall was tense, the air heavy with disappointment. Men who had served months in prison glared at him. Merchants who had lost business during strikes whispered in corners. Gandhi stood before them, his voice steady but softer than usual. He did not make excuses. He did not try to shift the blame. "I was deceived," he said plainly. "And for that, I bear responsibility. But I tell you this fight is not over. We have been struck down, but we are not broken. If anything, this betrayal proves what we are up against. And it proves that our only defense is to be stronger, more united, and more steadfast than before." There was silence. Then, slowly, the murmurs began. Heads nodded. The anger did not vanish, but it began to bend toward determination again. For Gandhi, the lesson was searing. Never mistake a handshake for victory. From that day forward, he treated negotiations not as signs of progress, but as battlegrounds in themselves. Words could be as dangerous as bullets. The betrayal also deepened his understanding of nonviolence. It was not just about refusing to strike back physically. It was about refusing to let bitterness corrode the cause. Hatred for Smuts would be easy. Discipline was harder. But make no mistake, Gandhi would not forget. And Smuts, for his part, would learn that Gandhi's memory was long and his patience even longer. In the months that followed, Satyagraha returned with renewed vigor. This time, there was no question of trusting promises without proof. Indians burned their registration certificates in public bonfires. Arrests surged. Jails overflowed again. Gandhi knew the price would be high. He knew more betrayals would come. But the man in the 1906 photograph, the one in the suit, with eyes that seemed to look past the camera, was no longer the young lawyer still learning the shape of resistance. He was now a leader forged in both victory and defeat, in trust given and trust broken. And in the next part, the fire would burn even hotter, because the government's answer to renewed resistance would not just be arrests. It would be violence. And Gandhi would have to decide how to keep a movement built on peace from collapsing under the weight of bloodshed. The betrayal of 1908 had hardened the movement. No more naive handshakes. No more giving the benefit of the doubt. Gandhi and his supporters returned to the streets with renewed determination, their message as clear as ever. They would not carry the hated registration documents, and they would not submit to unjust laws. The government, frustrated by the failure of arrests to break the resistance, turned to harsher measures. If prison could not crush the movement, perhaps pain could. It began quietly, almost invisibly. Police patrols in Indian neighborhoods became more aggressive. Passers-by were stopped and searched with unnecessary force. Those suspected of defying the registration law were not just arrested, they were beaten. Then came the first major clash. In early 1909, hundreds of Indian workers, many of them indentured laborers, gathered to march peacefully toward a government office, demanding the repeal of discriminatory taxes. They carried no weapons. Their banners bore no threats. Gandhi walked at the front, his pace steady, his hands clasped behind his back. Halfway to their destination, they met a wall of mounted police. The officers gave no warning. Batons swung down, striking shoulders, backs, heads. Horses surged forward, trampling those who could not move fast enough. The sound of wood cracking against bone echoed through the air. Men fell. Women screamed. Blood ran in the dust. Gandhi himself was struck on the arm, the pain sharp and immediate. But he did not raise his hands to defend himself. He did not run. He simply stood, absorbing the blows until the officers moved past him toward the rest of the crowd. When it was over, the ground was littered with the injured. Gandhi moved among them, helping lift men to their feet, tearing strips from his own clothing to bind wounds. His voice was calm, even as anger boiled in the eyes of those around him. Some of the younger men shouted for revenge. They wanted to strike back, to show the government that they would not be trampled without consequence. Gandhi gathered them and spoke in a low, steady voice. If we meet violence with violence, they will say we are criminals. If we endure it without striking back, they will have to call us something else, men of truth. It was not an easy message to accept. For many, the instinct to retaliate was overwhelming. But Gandhi knew the stakes. One act of retaliation could give the authorities the excuse they needed to crush the movement entirely, to paint it as a threat to public order. The days that followed were tense. Newspapers reported on the brutality, some condemning it, others justifying it. Smuts, ever calculating, remained silent. The police faced no punishment. And yet, the violence backfired. Instead of frightening the Indian community into submission, it ignited a deeper resolve. More marches were organized. More people refused to carry their registration papers. Arrests soared once again, and the jails overflowed. The government responded with another weapon, economic pressure. Employers were pressured to fire Indian workers who were arrested. Merchants lost licenses. Families found themselves without income. The goal was simple: starve the resistance into surrender. Gandhi's answer was the Phoenix Settlement, a cooperative community outside Durban where families could live simply, grow their own food, and support one another. It was both a refuge and a statement. They would not be broken by dependency on a system that sought to destroy them. Life in the settlement was far from easy. The work was hard, the conditions basic. Gandhi himself lived as simply as anyone else, sleeping on the floor, eating plain food, wearing simple clothes. Each day began with communal prayer, followed by hours of labor in the fields or the workshop. For Gandhi, this simplicity was more than survival, it was preparation. If the movement could free itself from the comforts and distractions of material life, it would be harder to intimidate. Still, outside the settlement, the struggle continued to escalate. The police began targeting gatherings before they could even start, arresting leaders preemptively. Trials were swift and sentences harsh. Gandhi knew the movement was approaching a breaking point. The people's faith in nonviolence was being tested not just by the blows of the police, but by hunger, by poverty, by the sight of their children suffering. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the Phoenix settlement, a young man approached Gandhi. His brother had been beaten in jail and later died from his injuries. The young man's eyes burned with grief. "How much longer are we to take this?" he demanded. "How many more must die before we fight back?" Gandhi placed a hand on his shoulder. "The question is not how much we can take," he said softly. "The question is whether we can take enough to make them see that what they do to us, they do to themselves." It was a hard truth, one that required almost superhuman restraint. But Gandhi believed that every act of suffering endured without retaliation was a stone laid in the foundation of justice. By the end of that year, the resistance had gained something unexpected: international attention. Reports of peaceful protesters being beaten and imprisoned reached Britain and even the United States. Public opinion began to shift. Questions were asked in Parliament. The image of the British Empire as a fair and just ruler was being challenged. Not by armed revolt, but by the sight of unarmed men and women enduring whips and batons. And yet, Gandhi knew that sympathy was not the same as victory. The laws remained. The discrimination persisted. The road ahead was still long, and the next phase would demand even greater sacrifice, because the government's next move would go beyond beatings and arrests. It would strike at the very families of the resistors, forcing Gandhi to make decisions that would test not just his courage, but his compassion. By 1910, the South African authorities had exhausted many of their usual tools of suppression. Arrests had failed to break the movement. Violence had only strengthened it. Economic pressure had not starved it into submission. So they reached for a weapon that history has shown to be as old as oppression itself. They targeted the families. The new policy was as brutal as it was simple. Any Indian man found to be in violation of the Asiatic laws, whether by refusing to register, crossing provincial borders without a permit, or engaging in illegal trade, would not only be imprisoned, but his wife and children could be deported back to India. It was a move calculated to break resolve without spilling more blood. Men who could endure beatings and jail might falter if the safety of their families was at stake. The first deportations happened quietly. A shopkeeper in Pretoria was arrested for failing to produce his registration certificate. Within a week, his wife and 2 small children were put on a ship to Bombay. No chance to say goodbye. No hearing. No appeal. Word spread quickly. Fear began to gnaw at the edges of the movement. Meetings grew more tense. Some whispered that perhaps it was time to compromise. Others accused Gandhi of pushing the community into unnecessary suffering. For Gandhi, the challenge was immense. He knew that holding the moral high ground meant little if his followers lost faith. And yet, he also knew that yielding now would mean every sacrifice so far. Every night in prison, every blow endured, would be for nothing. He began to visit families personally. In cramped, dimly lit homes, he would sit cross-legged on the floor with mothers who feared they would wake to find their husbands gone or their children taken. He listened. He did not minimize their fear. But he told them that this was precisely why they must continue. An injustice that can threaten your home today, he would say quietly, can destroy it tomorrow. If we do not resist now, there will be no end to what they can take. One evening, in a small settlement outside Johannesburg, Gandhi met a young couple. The husband a railway worker, the wife heavily pregnant. They had both pledged to resist registration. When Gandhi spoke to them about the possibility of imprisonment and deportation, the husband nodded without hesitation. But the wife, her eyes filled with tears. "If they take him," she whispered, "I will be left to give birth alone." Gandhi's throat tightened. He could not promise her that it would not happen. All he could promise was that if it did, the community would stand by her, and that her husband's sacrifice would not be in vain. It was not enough to take away the fear, but it was enough to keep their names on the rolls of resistance. The government's campaign intensified. Families were torn apart in the dead of night. Children were carried screaming onto trains. Gandhi himself narrowly avoided deportation more than once, shielded only by the legal status he still technically held as a British subject trained in law. And yet, this cruelty did not have the effect the authorities had hoped for. Instead of weakening the movement, it exposed the government's moral bankruptcy to the world. The image of the British Empire, the supposed champion of civilization, was now stained by the reality of women and children driven from their homes for no crime other than sharing the principles of their husbands and fathers. International outrage grew. Newspapers in Britain, India, and even America printed stories of the deportations. Questions were raised in Parliament. Smuts and his allies dismissed them as necessary measures, but the pressure was building. Inside South Africa, Gandhi adapted. The Phoenix settlement became not just a refuge, but a staging ground for families at risk. Those who feared deportation moved there, creating a community bound by more than ideology, bound by shared vulnerability. Men, women, and children worked the land together, sang together, prayed together. It was here that Gandhi's belief in the power of community deepened. He saw that resistance was not only in the marches and the prisons, it was in the daily act of caring for one another when the world outside was hostile. But the authorities were relentless. In mid-1911, a wave of arrests swept through the settlements. Gandhi himself was taken once more, this time alongside several of his closest allies. The Phoenix community was left leaderless, and rumors swirled that a mass deportation was planned. In his cell, Gandhi wrestled with the possibility that this might be the breaking point. He imagined returning to find the settlement empty, its fields overgrown, its homes abandoned. And yet, when he was released weeks later, he found it not empty, but stronger. The people had organized themselves, shared responsibilities, and kept the work going. The children had continued lessons under the shade of trees. Meals had been prepared communally. The Phoenix settlement had not just survived without him. It had flourished. It was a revelation. Gandhi realized that the movement could not depend solely on him. It had to be a living organism, able to grow even when its leader was cut off. This understanding would become crucial in the years ahead, because the next phase of the struggle would test not just Gandhi's leadership, but the ability of the entire community to endure something even more grueling than separation. The slow, grinding war of attrition that comes when an opponent refuses to yield but cannot completely suppress you. And as we move into that chapter, the man in the 1906 photograph is now almost unrecognizable from the young lawyer who first came to South Africa. The suit may still be there, but the eyes now hold something far deeper. The unshakable certainty that even in the face of cruelty, dignity can be defended, and that the power of a united people is far greater than the fear that seeks to divide them. By 1912, the struggle in South Africa had entered a strange, grinding phase. The great clashes of the early years, the marches, the mass arrests, the confrontations with mounted police, were less frequent. The government had realized that dramatic crackdowns brought international attention, and so they shifted tactics. They would no longer try to break the movement in one decisive blow. They would wear it down. It began with delays. Court cases dragged on for months. Petitions sat unanswered in government offices. Laws were amended slightly, just enough to give the illusion of progress, while their core injustices remained untouched. For the resistors, this was dangerous territory. When the enemy's attack is obvious, resistance can be fierce. But when the attack is invisible, a slow erosion of morale, it becomes harder to see and harder to fight. The Phoenix settlement still thrived, but the strain was showing. Harvests failed some seasons. Funds from supporters in India and Britain arrived late or in smaller amounts. Families who had endured years of sacrifice began to whisper about returning to India, where at least they could live without constant fear of arrest. And Gandhi felt the weight in his own bones. His hair was graying at the temples. His body, never robust, had grown thinner from years of simple living and repeated imprisonments. Yet he refused to slow down. He traveled constantly, visiting small Indian communities scattered across the country, in dusty railway towns, in sugarcane fields, in bustling market streets. In each place, he told the same message: we have not come this far to stop halfway. Every injustice we endure without retaliation brings us closer to justice itself. But there were days when even he wondered how long they could keep going. One evening, in a small hall in Durban, a merchant approached him after a meeting. The man's eyes were tired, his voice flat. "I have been arrested twice. My shop is failing. My children are hungry. You tell us to resist, but what will be left of us when this is over?" Gandhi placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "If we surrender now," he said quietly, "what will be left of us will not be worth keeping." It was a harsh truth, but it was also the one thing Gandhi believed with absolute certainty. The cost of surrender was always greater than the cost of endurance. To fight the creeping fatigue, Gandhi introduced what he called constructive work. If the people could not always be in active protest, they could still live the principles of the movement. They began making their own cloth, khadi, spinning cotton on simple wheels instead of buying imported textiles. They held literacy classes for workers who had never been taught to read. They pooled funds to support the families of prisoners. These acts were not as dramatic as marches or rallies, but they kept the movement alive. They gave people purpose in the long stretches between confrontations. And, quietly, they undermined the economic hold the colonial system had over the Indian community. Still, the government's strategy of attrition was effective. Every month, a few more families left. Every month, another small business closed under the weight of fines and harassment. Newspapers stopped covering the struggle regularly. It was no longer news. Gandhi responded by tightening his own discipline. He simplified his diet further, sometimes fasting to draw attention to specific injustices or to unite the community after internal disputes. He wrote tirelessly. Letters to newspapers, pamphlets explaining the principles of satyagraha, personal notes to supporters in far-off towns. His words traveled faster than he could, keeping the spark alive in places his feet could not reach. There were moments, though, when the fight felt endless. In 1913, as yet another year passed without real change, a group of younger resistors confronted Gandhi privately. They respected him, but they wanted more aggressive tactics. Strikes that would cripple industries, direct confrontations that could not be ignored. Gandhi listened carefully. Then he told them, "The strength of this movement is not in how hard we can strike, but in how hard we can stand without striking." Some left unconvinced. The slow war was taking its toll on leadership too. Some of Gandhi's closest allies began to drift away, burned out by the constant pressure and the lack of decisive victory. Others were tempted by offers from the government. Small personal concessions in exchange for stepping away from the movement. And yet, the core held, not because the fight was easy, but because those who remained had built their lives around it. The Phoenix settlement and its sister community, Tolstoy Farm, were living testaments to the idea that resistance could be woven into daily life. By late 1913, Gandhi knew that the only way to break the deadlock was to find a new spark. Something that would reignite the urgency of the struggle, force the government to act, and bring the world's eyes back to South Africa. That spark came, unexpectedly, from a law that had long been a source of quiet resentment: the tax on ex-indentured Indian workers. This law, cruel in its simplicity, required former indentured laborers to pay a heavy annual tax just to remain in the country after their contracts ended. For many, it meant choosing between poverty in South Africa and poverty in India. Gandhi saw in this tax a unifying cause, something that touched not just the educated and the merchants, but the poorest members of the Indian community. If they rose together against it, the movement could swell to a size the government could not ignore. And so, as the long grind of attrition threatened to sap the last of the movement's strength, Gandhi began to prepare for what would become one of the most decisive confrontations of his years in South Africa, the Great March of 1913. The year was 1913. For a decade, Gandhi and the Indian community in South Africa had endured arrests, beatings, deportations, and the slow grind of attrition. The movement had survived, but it needed a spark, something to lift it from survival to decisive action. That spark came in the form of a law that had long been resented but never fully confronted: the 3-pound tax imposed on former indentured Indian workers. For the poorest in the community, it was a cruel trap, a sum so heavy it forced them into endless cycles of debt or drove them back to India with nothing. To Gandhi, this tax was more than unfair, it was immoral. And because it touched the lives of thousands, from sugarcane workers to railway porters, it had the power to unite the community as never before. The plan was bold. Gandhi would lead a mass march of workers from Natal into the Transvaal, crossing provincial borders without the required permits, in open defiance of the law. They would demand the repeal of the tax and the recognition of Indian rights. The march would not be a riot, not a charge. It would be a river of humanity flowing across the land, slow, steady, and impossible to ignore. In early November, the march began. At first, there were a few hundred, men in worn work clothes, women carrying children on their hips, elders leaning on sticks. Gandhi walked near the front, his pace measured, his eyes scanning the road ahead. Behind him, the line stretched like a living spine across the dusty landscape. Word spread quickly. In town after town, more joined. Laborers leaving the cane fields, miners emerging from the shafts, merchants locking their shops. Soon, the march numbered in the thousands. The sound of their footsteps was like the heartbeat of a single, united body. The government could not ignore it. Police patrols appeared along the route, watching, waiting for orders. At first, they let the marchers pass, perhaps hoping the sheer hardship of the journey would thin their numbers. But Gandhi had prepared for that. At each stop, the marchers shared food, slept under makeshift shelters, and encouraged one another with songs and prayers. The sight was unlike anything South Africa had seen. The press began to take notice. Photographers captured images of mothers walking barefoot with infants in their arms, of old men leaning on each other for support, of Gandhi himself, small, thin, but steady as a metronome at the front. After several days, the government made its move. Near the town of Newcastle, mounted police blocked the road. The order was given: disperse or be arrested. Gandhi stepped forward, calm as ever, and told the officer in charge, "We will not turn back." The arrests began immediately. Gandhi was taken first, then his closest lieutenants, then dozens, then hundreds. But the march did not end. It simply split into smaller groups, each continuing the journey under new leaders. For every marcher taken away, another stepped into their place. In prison, Gandhi followed the march's progress through scraps of news smuggled in by visitors. He learned that miners in the Transvaal had gone on strike in solidarity, that women were refusing to cook in households that supported the tax, that railway workers were slowing operations by losing paperwork and taking sudden sick days. The government, alarmed by the scale of the unrest, doubled down. More arrests, more beatings, more deportations. But with every crackdown, the movement's moral position grew stronger in the eyes of the public. Then came the turning point. In December, news of the march and the mass arrests reached India and Britain. Protests erupted in Calcutta, Bombay, and London. Members of the British Parliament, not usually eager to challenge colonial policy, began to ask pointed questions about what was happening in South Africa. The image of unarmed men, women, and children marching for their rights was proving far more dangerous to the government than any weapon. By the end of the year, the pressure was too great to ignore. In January 1914, after negotiations that stretched for weeks, an agreement was reached. The hated £3 tax would be abolished, and some of the more oppressive restrictions on Indian movement would be eased. It was not total victory, but it was real, tangible progress. When Gandhi was released from prison, he returned to the Phoenix settlement to find a crowd waiting. Men and women who had marched, who had suffered, who had lost livelihoods but kept their dignity. They welcomed him not as a distant leader, but as one of their own, a man who had walked beside them every step of the way. The Great March had done more than win concessions. It had proven that mass, disciplined, nonviolent action could move the machinery of empire. It had shown that the principles of satyagraha, tested in the fires of a decade-long struggle, could not only survive but triumph against injustice. And yet, for Gandhi, the victory was bittersweet. He knew that his work in South Africa was nearing its end. The fight against injustice there was not over, but his homeland, India, was calling. A far greater struggle awaited him, one that would dwarf even the achievements of the Great March. The man in the 1906 photograph. The suited lawyer with eyes like sharpened steel had now become something else entirely. A leader who had learned to wield truth and discipline like weapons, who had seen the power of ordinary people united in a just cause, and who was ready to take those lessons to the largest stage of all. In the next part, we'll watch Gandhi prepare to leave South Africa, closing one chapter of his life, but carrying its lessons toward a destiny that would make his name known in every corner of the world. In July 1914, as the chill of a South African winter settled over the land, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi began to prepare for his departure. The decision had been months in the making. The agreement reached after the Great March had brought real gains. The hated £3 tax was gone, and some restrictions on Indian movement had been eased. But Gandhi knew that his role in this struggle had reached its natural end. Others could carry the torch now. His homeland, India, was calling. Reports of growing unrest under British rule filled the letters he received from friends and allies there. The techniques of satyagraha, tested and refined in South Africa, were tools he believed could be wielded on a far larger scale. But leaving was not easy. South Africa had been his crucible. It was here that he had arrived as a young, ambitious lawyer, dressed in Western suits and speaking in the polished tones of an English-trained barrister. And it was here that he had been stripped of illusions, of comfort, of the belief that justice could always be won in courtrooms. The Gandhi preparing to leave was not the Gandhi who had arrived. He was leaner, both in body and in material possessions. His clothes were simple, his habits austere. His voice carried a quiet authority that came not from titles or education, but from the weight of sacrifice endured. In the weeks before his departure, Gandhi traveled to the communities that had sustained the struggle. The neighborhoods of Durban, the markets of Johannesburg, the settlements of Phoenix and Tolstoy Farm. Everywhere he went, people gathered to see him one last time. Some came to thank him. Others came simply to look at him, as if trying to understand how one man had managed to stand against an entire system and not be broken. Mothers brought their children forward, urging them to remember this moment. Elderly men clasped his hands and whispered blessings. Gandhi did not speak of victory. Instead, he spoke of responsibility. "What we have done here," he told them, "is not mine alone. It belongs to each of you. You have shown the world that there is a strength greater than the fist. Do not let that strength fade." Privately, he reflected on what had been won and what had been lost. The movement had achieved tangible reforms, yes, but not all its goals had been met. Racial discrimination remained entrenched. Many families had been torn apart by deportations. Some wounds, both physical and emotional, would never heal. He also thought of the men who had stood beside him and the ones who had fallen away. Resistance, he had learned, was not a straight road. It twisted through betrayals and reconciliations, through moments of unity and moments of deep division. On the day of his departure, the docks were crowded. Supporters lined the wharf, waving handkerchiefs, holding banners, some singing hymns. Gandhi stood at the rail of the ship, Kasturba beside him, his eyes scanning the faces below. Among them were miners who had marched in 1913, merchants who had been jailed for refusing to register, women who had sheltered fugitives from the police. They had all given something, time, freedom, safety, to the cause. And they had all, in Gandhi's eyes, proven that the principles of truth and nonviolence could hold fast against the machinery of oppression. As the ship's horn sounded, Gandhi raised his hand in farewell. It was not a grand gesture, just a simple lifting of the palm. But to those watching, it was enough. They understood that this was not an ending, but a passing of the flame. The journey ahead was uncertain. War was brewing in Europe. The First World War would erupt within weeks. India was still firmly under British control. The techniques that had worked in South Africa might face entirely new challenges in the vast, complex political landscape of his homeland. But Gandhi carried with him something far more valuable than a political strategy. He carried proof, living proof, that an oppressed people, united in disciplined nonviolence, could force even the most stubborn of powers to bend. And somewhere in the back of his mind, perhaps, was the memory of that day in 1906, when he had sat in a Johannesburg photographer's studio in a crisp suit, staring into the lens with the eyes of a man who had just chosen his path. That photograph had captured a moment before the battles, before the prison cells, before the marches and the betrayals. It had captured the moment when a lawyer decided to become something more. Now, as the South African coastline faded into the horizon, Gandhi was no longer just the man in that photograph. He was the embodiment of the lessons it contained. That truth is not fragile, that dignity is not negotiable, and that even the smallest figure can cast a long shadow when he stands in the light of justice. The ship turned eastward, cutting through the waters of the Indian Ocean. Ahead lay Bombay, and with it, the vast challenge of awakening a nation of hundreds of millions. Gandhi did not know exactly how it would unfold, but he knew this. Everything he had learned in South Africa, every blow, every loss, every triumph, was preparation for what was to come. And in the next part, we will step into that return to India and look back at the man in the photograph one final time, understanding at last how that image contains the seed of everything he would one day become. We return, at last, to the photograph. Johannesburg, 1906. A man of 37, dressed in a sharp, dark suit, hair neatly parted, mustache trimmed. The posture is formal, the gaze direct. For most, it's just a portrait, another relic from another era. But now, you and I see it differently. We know that behind those eyes is a mind already wrestling with the deepest questions a person can face. What is justice? What am I willing to lose for it? What am I willing to endure? When that shutter clicked, Gandhi had not yet marched across provinces with thousands at his back. He had not yet spent weeks in prison cells, or been beaten in the dust by mounted police, or seen families torn apart by deportation orders. But he had made the choice, and that choice would shape every step he took from that moment onward. It's easy to look at historic photographs and imagine the subjects as fixed, unchanging figures. The truth is, photographs lie. Or rather, they only tell a fraction of the truth. The Gandhi in this image is not yet the Mahatma, not yet the icon of spinning wheel and homespun cloth. He is a man in transition, still wearing the armor of a Western suit, still using the tools of a lawyer trained in London, still refining his understanding of race, empire, and morality. But we've seen the road ahead of him. We've walked with him through the cold night on a train platform in Pietermaritzburg. We've heard the knock on the door that brought the first arrest. We've stood in the halls where trust was betrayed and in the fields where workers marched under the sun. We've watched him bend under the weight of attrition and rise again in the Great March of 1913. And now, when we look into those eyes, we see all of that. Not because it was visible in the moment, but because history has revealed what that moment contained. There's something almost haunting about it. In 1906, Gandhi could not have foreseen that his methods in South Africa would one day be used to challenge the entire British Empire in India. He could not have known that his name would be spoken in whispers by both those who loved him and those who feared him. And yet, there is an undeniable stillness in his gaze, as if some part of him already understood that the decision he had made was irreversible. Think of what that means. When we take a stand, a real stand, we rarely know the full cost. We can guess at it. We can imagine the obstacles. But the truth is, the journey will always be harder, longer, and lonelier than we expect. And still, some choose to begin. That is what you are looking at in this photograph, the moment before the leap. The moment when a man steps away from comfort and toward conviction, without knowing whether he will land on solid ground or in the abyss. It's worth asking ourselves, how many of us have a 1906 photograph moment in our own lives? A moment when the choice is made quietly, without fanfare, but changes everything that comes after? Most of the time, no one else sees it happening, but we feel it, the weight of it, even if we can't yet name it. For Gandhi, that choice led him into a life that would demand almost unbearable discipline. He would endure ridicule, imprisonment, physical attacks, and endless political battles. He would face dissent not only from his enemies, but from his friends and allies. And yet, through it all, he would hold to the core belief that truth, satya, combined with the courage to endure without violence, agraha, was a force that no empire could ultimately defeat. By the time the world knew him as Mahatma, the man in the suit was long gone. In his place stood a figure wrapped in simple cloth, walking barefoot, carrying nothing but a staff. But that transformation was not magic, and it was not sudden. It began here, in the years we have just traced, in the crucible of South Africa, in the battles that shaped his methods, in the sacrifices that hardened his resolve. The photograph is a reminder that history's giants start as ordinary people, often uncertain, often flawed, often in the middle of becoming. Gandhi in 1906 still had much to learn. He still carried biases from his upbringing. He still moved between two worlds, unsure of which he truly belonged to. But he had taken the first step toward becoming someone who could unite millions without raising a sword. That's the power of this image. It's not just a picture of Gandhi. It's a picture of potential, of a life that could have gone 100 different ways, but instead followed a narrow, often painful path towards something greater than the self. So the next time you see it, this man in the suit, looking straight into the camera, remember what we've walked through. Remember that those eyes had seen injustice and decided not to turn away. Remember that behind the formality of the pose was a will being sharpened for battles not yet begun. And maybe, just maybe, see yourself in it. Because history is not just the story of the people who became famous. It is also the story of choices, the quiet, often invisible choices that ordinary people make every day. The kind of choice that says, I will not accept this. I will not be silent. I will not turn away. That's what lives in this photograph. That's what makes it more than paper and ink. It's a fragment of time when one man's decision began to ripple outward across oceans and decades until it touched the lives of millions, including ours, right now. The ship from South Africa would carry Gandhi home to India, where his struggle would expand beyond anything he had faced before. But even then, in the salt air and the endless horizon, the man in the photograph was still with him, the part of himself that had first learned to stand and not move, even when the world told him to step aside. And maybe that's why the gaze feels so direct, even now, more than a century later. Because he is not just looking at the photographer, he is looking at us. And the question in his eyes is the same one he asked himself in 1906. When your moment comes, will you stand?